Greetings everyone. I'm just here to bring you a brief overview of the Pyrochon spec. So without further ado, we're going to get into the nitty gritty of it. If you take a moment to view the spec here, it is 40 Archon and 36 Pyromancer. Now, the biggest thing that you want to take into account before using a spec like this is what your raid can accommodate for. The important thing here is that this really isn't a spec for 20-man raids. It's more of a spec for 10-man raids, as it pairs beautifully with a bard and does extremely respectable DPS. So here's some of the things that you're going to be missing out on. Point to point, which is kind of just a gimmick utility. It's not really terribly useful anymore at this point in content's progression. Used to have some interesting things that you could do with it, but not a whole lot anymore. Archon's Bulwark, which is just a lazy man's way of not having to cast the buffs that make themselves stronger, and you won't actually have to do any of that in this spec anyway, so it's not really relevant. You also lose Granite Salvo, so while that might seem like a huge deal, again, this is a 10-man setting that we're talking about. In a 20-man, it is pretty important, but I believe that the Bard buff will overwrite this anyway and render it irrelevant. You will lose Burning Purpose. You will also lose Surging Flare, which is a pretty big one, as it might seem. However, you will be able to make it work, and again, it's for a 10-man setting. They're usually not going to have it anyway. And you also lose Lingering Dust. So, not that bad in terms of what you're losing. The spec here is 40 Archon, and that's about as deep as you can go without sacrificing some really heavy-hitting abilities in the Pyromancer tree. And again, this spec's purpose here is to gain the DPS without losing that utility that's going to buff your raid. So it's pretty easy to work with. As you can see, my hotbar does not have a whole lot of stuff going on down there. We have our three primary buffs here, which are going to be Pyromancer's Armor, Glyphs of Power, and Flaring Intellect. And then you have the three auras that you're going to be able to cast. It's important to note as well that the spec is much more effective if you have the Archon Crystal for your raid 4-piece set, as it gives a significant amount of spell power per Archon aura that you have active. So that is the crystal that you're going to want to be using here. Now, most of the spec can be done in terms of the damage dealing in one single macro that you're going to be able to look at here. And the macro is pretty simple. It's going to prioritize Flame Bolt, then Inferno, then Volcanic Bomb, then Earthen Barrage, then Spark Shower, then Fireball, then Countdown and Searing Vitality. And Countdown and Searing Vitality will only be used during phases with movement. You can put Neural Prod in there with the Zero Dominator, which is actually why I have that as my off soul. But I haven't found in many situations where I'm actually using this spec right now that there are going to be huge amounts of downtime where I'm going to need to cast more than 2 spells while I'm on the run. And if at any point I do come across that, you can bet I will add it in there. However, I'm not that far in GA right now, and any content that I use this for in the 10-mans is kind of light on the movement, as my main is Chloro. So that's always going to be on one of those case-by-case perspectives that you're going to want to take into account. Now, if you see the buffs that I have in the bar, we obviously have Flaring Power. Flaring Power is a huge one of the primary reasons for taking the spec. You do have Power Drain. Power Drain is not going to be your primary charge consumer if we're talking about damage, but it's a very, very useful ability to help the raid out. Obviously, the utility of that is still there. You have Ashen Defense and Crumbling Resistance, and you can always work that out with your Bard. Some Bards habitually cast it. Obviously, it's a little more efficient for the Archon to do it since they last for 5 minutes. Other than that, you have Burning Shield, which is really, really awesome. You never run out of MP in the Archon build. It just doesn't consume it at that kind of rate. So this is a really good ability to have up almost all the time, especially when you know big damage is coming. Help your heroes out a little bit. Then you have Lava Field and Waning Power, which are going to be used as group and self buffs respectively, and your DPS ability. So I'll show you how the spec works. One of the biggest things that you can do is prioritize internalized charge for when your 3 big ones are coming off cooldown. So right after Flame Bolt, and you're going to be able to kind of time this, you can put the buffs on your bar to be able to see when they're going to come off cooldown. And we can kind of look at that right there. I'll drag them on, and you'll be able to see exactly when they're coming off cooldown, so you know when to make sure you have internalized charge up. So without further ado, I am going to get started and show you exactly what kind of DPS this build is capable of. you can see here that flaring power has worn off, so we can just skip to internalized charge by itself here, which is awesome. And we're going to save that lava field and that waning power for when it's appropriate. So we're going to cast that right now. That way, the big three will get the benefit of those buffs. You kind of want to try to have internalized charge for Cinder Burst on. It's more important for the big three. But Cinder Burst does generate a lot of charge, so if you do not have internalized charge up when Cinder Burst is rolling, it's not something that you really want to beat yourself up over, because you can use it as a method to regain that charge that you spend. So it's one of those neither here nor there things. It's really going to build on a personal preference. There's not one method that's super better than the other, and if you have it up half the time, you're doing something right. And of course, if you hit on charge, you want to make sure that you toggle that internalized charge on. No point in wasting excess charge. Not a whole lot of terribly crazy stuff going on here. It's really all about that rotation that we were dealing with just now, and I got a little bit sloppy and let my things overlap, but not a big deal. Recover for it here, as you'll see, and then just pull that off. And it's pulling a very respectable 13k DPS, which will obviously benefit from a Bard. And go even higher in a raid setting, so especially useful for things like the Typheria burn method, as I've heard. I have not seen yet, but I've heard that it's incredibly useful and recommended in GA. And for certain bosses in there, as you know, with 10 mans, you just lack the raid composition to make some of those flexible choices. And it's pulling a pretty consistent 13k DPS, which is very respectable. See those big three hit extremely hard with internalized charge up and the proper debuffs on the enemy. But that's pretty much it. The spec has a ton of utility, very easy to get along with and play in a raid. Pretty simple, so you're not looking at some craziness going on there, and just very fun to work with. I do enjoy it a lot personally, just for the utility that it adds without sacrificing a ton of that DPS or anything that you'd be getting from any other spec. It's just very versatile, and even does very respectable in a 5-man setting as well, as you're often not going to be losing anything to provide very significant buffs and debuffs for your party. So I did hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me at pretty much any time. My name is Thanix, Thanixx, and I am over on the Fablite server with Nicely Played. So take care, everyone. Thank you for viewing, and you have a good one.